Let's make sure we record this. So just so you know that I do record this, those of you who haven't been here before, I record the session. So be aware of anything you say or any gestures you make on video. If you feel a need to do anything that's not appropriate, you know what to do. You got mute and you got the video blackout. So anyway, welcome everyone. We begin Sefer Shemot this morning, and I'm going to focus on a couple of elements of this week's Parsha, actually pretty much what we read this morning at the Minyan. Before I do that, though, there are a couple of outstanding issues from last week. We had asked, so a question was asked, where does the expression Ad Mea Ve'asrim come? So now, Larry, you found an answer. Did you want to share that with everyone?
Sure, that was very simple, right at the very beginning of Bereshit, when Hashem is creating the world. In Parashah 6:3, I think it is. Let me look it up. I think it's 6:3. He when he creates man, he was it? Let's just see here. It was the 3:6. I'm sorry.
I'll be your quoting Tanakh.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 3:6.
Right. So God said, my breath shall not abide in man forever, since he too is flesh. Let the days allowed him be 120 years.
Right. Right.
And in addition to that's one source. There's another source that's also recognized as an indication of man's perhaps ideal or striven for age. We talk, how long did Moshe live? 120 years. We read that right at the end of course, the Torah in Parashat V'zot HaBracha. We read about Moshe living to the age of 120. Interestingly, comparable to what we were talking about last week, the ages of the various patriarchs, the matriarchs, unfortunately, their ages aren't really given in as much detail. So one living 175, 180, 137, 110. But apparently that 120 is the golden number. I suppose nowadays we don't necessarily want to live that long based on some of the things that we're afflicted with in older age. But anyway, it's a beautiful phrase. And just while we're talking about numbers, because last week we also talked about the fact that Joseph and his brothers, after the Egyptians had mourned for Jacob for 70 days before he's buried, Joseph and his brothers mourned Jacob for 7 days. So that idea of Shiva, the ritual of observing a very intense period of grief for 7 days after someone's burial, not after their death, after their burial, stems perhaps from last week's Parsha. And what about Shloshim, if we're talking about numbers? Anyone know where the Shloshim tradition comes from? That second period of transition from the Shiva to the Shloshim? Why do we mark 30 days? Well, we go back to Moses and Aaron. It says at both occasions in Parshat Chukat, when Aaron passes, it talks about the fact that Bnei Israel, they mourned him for 30 days. And also at the end of the Sefer Torah, it talks about the 30 days mourning for Moses, the same period of time. So we have all these indications in the Torah. It's not arbitrary numbers that come from some kind of sociological or psychological study. It's a tradition based on our texts. And of course, there are other fascinating numbers, but we're not going to deal with that today. One last question, which we don't often ask. We talk about the fact that Jacob demanded of Joseph that he be buried where his grandfather, his grandmother, his father, his mother, and of course his first wife, Leah, were buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah. Joseph asks that he be taken to the land of Israel when they go up, that he be brought. He doesn't specify where he wants to be buried. So you might ask, why does he not want to be buried where his forefathers are buried? Well, we know that portions will be assigned to each of the tribes, and as you might think, Joseph, of course, is buried near Shechem, which is one of the portions assigned to his two sons. But let me ask you another question. What about all of Joseph's brothers? Why don't they ask that their remains be taken? Why don't we hear about them asking their children that their remains be taken and buried in the land of Israel? Jacob said that God will, he says, God says, Jacob says to his sons, God will notice and make sure that God takes you up from Egypt into the promised land to fulfill the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and others, of course. So the brothers know that they're going back there. Why do they not want their remains to be taken back to the Holy Land? We're not going to delve into that now, but just a little bit of thought. Not that consistency is anything that we see to any great measure in the Torah and the Tanakh in general, but you might have thought that had the brothers fully felt this connection with Jacob and with his connection to the land, that perhaps they may have asked the same thing that their brother asked. We don't know. Larry, you got a thought?
Yes, I was questioning why Esau didn't want to be buried in the cave. I mean, he was a brother to Jacob, and he had been the firstborn, and wouldn't he have been entitled to a spot in the cave because Isaac was his father, and why wasn't he also buried in the cave?
So I think you're right.
And we learn why. We learn why is because he had sold his birthright. If you remember in Parashah told us, he had sold his birthright for a bowl of lentil soup, red soup that he had came in from the fields. He was hungry, and he wanted some soup, and he sold Jacob. He sold the birthright to Jacob in exchange for the bowl of soup. But
okay,
when it came time for him to die, he actually, when they brought the body of Jacob up to the cave, he wanted to be, he blocked the way. And the story goes that he was blocking the way, and one of the sons of Dan, I believe his name was Hushim. He got so angry. He was deaf. Hushim. He got so angry that he actually cut off the head of Esau, and the head rolled into the cave, and it was buried there with Jacob.
There's some fascinating midrashim, no doubt, on this and many other matters. The fact is, it wouldn't really fit our story, I imagine. We don't know if Esav really wanted to be buried in the cave, perhaps not. Whether he's entitled or not is another question. But of course, Esav settled in a different land, according to the Torah, in what became Edom, which is on the southeast side of Israel and what is today's the south part of Jordan, perhaps north part of Saudi Arabia. So he was somewhere else. He'd established his kingdom elsewhere, and again, because he's not the heir to because he sold his birthright or for other reasons, he's not an heir to the heritage of Abraham and Isaac and Sarah and Rebecca, of course. So it wouldn't be appropriate if he were buried there. But it's a fascinating question about why other sons were not buried there as well. Let's continue with Shmot. Just before we start, often we look at modern interpretations. We don't consider perhaps as much as we might some of the traditional medieval interpretations. So I was going back among books that I'm glad I still have, and I found the set that I purchased when I began studying at Associated. And of course, they're a very traditional study in Hebrew. I'm not sure what you'll be able to see of this, but if you're familiar with the typical Mikrot Gdolot, where you have the Hebrew text up in the top in the large print, and all around that with tiny print, all sorts of other Mefarshim commentators from various periods of time, including at the top Aramaic translations from the medieval period. You've got Rashi, Ramban, Nachmanides, Ibn Ezra, Aviezer, Sforno, Or Chaim, Kleyakar, Balturim, Rashbam, all these fascinating medieval commentators And of course, in the Hebrew, it might be a little bit overwhelming, but there is something, and I recommend this, anyone who wants to consider that. It doesn't have all of them, but it's something called Mikraot Gdolot, the Commentator's Bible, put out by the JPS. And it has a similar format, if you can see, with the text at the top, and around that, all the various, you don't have to read the text just to see the format, with all the various medieval commentators around, and it makes it very accessible. So I'm going to use a little bit of that today. And as we study two issues, I hope I'll get to two of them, in this week's Parashah. So the first thing I want to relate to is, and rather than pull up that format, I'm going to pull up a different format. I've encouraged you, if you have access to something called Sefaria, which is a wonderful resource available for study of all sorts of different texts, not just the Tanakh, of course, but the Talmud and many other different texts. So I'm going to pull that up on screen. And I just want to study maybe a couple of verses today with you, but we're going to try to look a little bit as well at some of the commentary that's offered. So the verse I want to start with is something we read this morning. If you look at verse 15 here, hopefully it's largest. Can everybody see the screen? Is it visible now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this verse is quite fascinating. Vayomer melech Mitzrayim lamialdot ha'ivriot asher shem ha'achad shifra v'shem ha'shenit pu'ah. So fascinatingly, it says Vayomer melech Mitzrayim. So the king of Egypt, interestingly, it doesn't say Paro. It says the king of Egypt said to, and we're not sure exactly what this means, Lamialdot Ha'ivriot, the Hebrew midwives. We'll come back to this second. And it mentions their names, Shifra and Puah. So we're just going to take a look at one of the commentators. Let's start with Rashi. So I bring up this Sefaria because it's a wonderful source. You go into the text. I'll just show you how you get to it. You get to the text itself, and then when you click on the line, you get an option to do all sorts of things. You can get commentary, Targum, mentions in the Talmud, Midrash, etc. So we're just going to go to the commentaries today. We're going to take a look at what Rashi has to say about this verse. The first one is a little bit too technical. Let's go to what he says about, and of course, those of you who prefer to go back to the Hebrew, you have that option as well. Not in the Rashi text, unfortunately, in the Rashi font, the famous Rashi font. But we'll take a look at it in the English. So the fact that they mentioned two named midwives. So these are the names perhaps commonly used, but who are these two midwives? So Rashi says, Shifra was Yocheved. She bore this additional name because she used to put the babe after its birth into good physical condition, Mishaperet, proved by the care she bestowed upon it. And Puah was none other than Miriam. She bore this additional name because she used to call aloud and speak and croon to the babe, just as women do to soothe a child when it is crying. So this one aspect of connecting these two midwives to two specific characters who haven't yet been identified. We haven't read anything about Miriam and Yocheved yet. They're only going to be mentioned a little bit later on in the Parashah. So we learn about them in a certain task that is crucial regarding the survival of the Israelites in Egypt. Let's go back to this other phrase for a moment, this idea of mialdot ha'ivriot. So what do you understand from mialdot ha'ivriot, Hebrew midwives? Take away this idea that it's Yocheved and Miriam. Eliminate that from that for now. Don't just ignore that I brought that up as one interpretation. Who are these midwives? Anyone want to give that a shot? It says Hebrew midwives. So different Mefarshim say, well, is it midwives who happen to be Hebrews, and they're the ones who are serving as midwives? Or is it midwives who are not Israelites, Egyptians, who are in charge and serve as midwives for the Hebrew children? So different Mefarshim, different commentators suggest either of those. What do you think would make most sense? Ignoring, of course, what I said before about Yocheved and Miriam. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Larry?
Yeah, I think they were they were Hebrew women who assisted in the births of the children of the Hebrew children. I think
Okay.
there's commentary.
So
on
those
that.
are Hebrew.
I would differ.
And one, just 1 second, John. And one of the commentators say, why do they call them Hebrew? Because they are descended from Aver. This idea of Aver, one of the generations from before Avraham. Aver, this idea, or perhaps those who crossed over, Aver, Lanahar, Ivrim, this idea of Ivrim. And in any case, descended from something that connects them to the Israelites in Egypt. John, you had another opinion.
Yes. If they didn't trust the Hebrews, why would they trust Hebrew midwives? So politically, it makes more sense to trust another Egyptian, one of your own people, to carry out this morbid task, not one of, you wouldn't ask a Hebrew to murder a Hebrew.
Okay, so that's a fascinating question. And what I would suggest is that, although it may be somewhat anachronistic, what better way to cause dissent and demoralization than to get the people you are trying to oppress and subjugate to somehow turn against themselves and be the ones who commit these heinous tasks, as opposed to having someone else from your nation do it. And if you think about different cases in history, and unfortunately we don't have to go so far back, if you think about some of the great challenges faced by Jews during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, and it's not my place, I don't think it's our place to judge any of those people, but certain Jews in different situations and different circumstances, whether in the ghetto or whether in the camps themselves, for one reason or another, were forced into serving in tasks where they were actually performing some of the tasks demanded by the Nazis, by the Germans, perhaps similar to this. Maybe it is, in fact, those Hebrew midwives, because, and same thing for having the Israelite taskmasters. There were Egyptian taskmasters who probably supervised everything, but you had Israelites who were involved in making sure that the daily brick amount quota was done properly. Otherwise, they would be beaten. And if you recall later on in the Parashah, it says, Vayuku Shotrei Israel, because they were beaten because it was almost impossible to meet the quota, brought about as a result, at least according to the Torah, of Moses' demand that Pharaoh let the people go, or let them go worship their God in the desert. So Pharaoh made things even harder, and it's the Jewish, or the Jewish, not Jewish, but Israelite taskmasters who are beaten because the Israelites can no longer meet that quota. So this idea of involving members of a subjugated, oppressed people in the oppression itself is something that isn't unique to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, and perhaps it's not unique to the Egyptian situation. And throughout history, oppressors, tyrants have not just used their own national minions to perform these tasks, but they, in horribly manipulative ways, have involved those of the oppressed nation itself, the oppressed people itself, to maintain order. And that's, of course, that's a whole discussion in itself. But we see this here, perhaps, that in fact those midwives were Hebrew midwives, meaning that they were Israelites themselves. So this other thought is that they were not Hebrew midwives, because you might say, Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim lameldot ha'ivriot. Why would Pharaoh be talking with slaves, with women from the oppressed nation? Why would Pharaoh go to speak with them? So one of the reasons, perhaps, this one explanation of it, is that Pharaoh's speaking to midwives who were Egyptian, but who supervised all the others. And there's another fascinating commentary, I believe it's from Ibn Ezra, talks about the fact that there were probably about 500 midwives dealing with this issue of the Hebrew births. And it was Shifra and Puah who supervised them and made sure that they were supposed to do what they did. Now, if that's the case, and that perhaps has some merit to it, that idea, it makes it even more pronounced and even more impressive that Shifra and Puah don't do as Pharaoh demanded. Because what does it say here? It says, Vatirana hamiyaldot et haElohim, v'lo asu kasher diber alehen melech Mitzrayim, v'techayena et hayeladim. So there's this fascinating verse that says, now it doesn't call them Hamildot Ha'ivriot. It doesn't call them the Hebrew midwives anymore. They've lost that designation. They're just called the Mialdot. And perhaps this is a further indication of the fact that when we talked about them before, they're called the Mialdot Ha'ivriot because they give or they bring about and aid the birth of the Hebrew children. But here they're the Mialdot because they're Egyptian. And the unique thing here, you wouldn't be so surprised if they were Hebrew or Israelite midwives that they feared God. Why wouldn't they? They're part of this nation which perhaps to some extent and in some measure has maintained its association as a nation. We'll come back to that in a moment, and perhaps some connection with their God, Elohim. But the unique thing here is that why would we mention that? Because they fear God, because they're not Israelite. They fear the Israelite God, Elohim. And they fear that God more than they fear Melech Mitzrayim, more than they fear the king of Egypt. And so they do not do as he demanded or said to them to do. It doesn't say Vayitzav. It doesn't say he commanded. He says Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim in the earlier verse. And here it says Kasher Diber Aleihem, as he had spoken to them. It doesn't say he commanded them. And perhaps, therefore, it makes more sense that he's talking to Egyptian midwives. He doesn't need to command them. He's assuming that through their identification as Egyptians, he doesn't need to command them. All he needs to do is tell them or say to them, because of course, as Egyptians, they will have the security and the best interests of their people at heart. And that's why this is such a powerful statement. Despite all that, even he only said it to them, but they didn't do according to what he'd asked. They feared the Israelite God more. And it emphasizes not only did they not do what Pharaoh asked of them to do, but techayena. They not only did they not kill them, but they did something that caused them to live. So there seemed to be, as we often talk about in the Torah, we don't repeat things twice. It's clear. V'lo asu kasher diber lehem. They did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. So of course, we know they didn't kill them. If they didn't do what they were told to do, they didn't kill them. Why does it have to say v'techayena et hayeladim? Why does it bother saying that they? How does it translate it here? They let the boys live. So they must have done something greater. And then there are other Mefarshim. I'm not going to go back and forth between the commentators, but if you get into Sefaria, you can go to the various ones, whether it's Ibn Evra or Bechor Shor, all sorts of fascinating ones. And it says, not only did they not kill them, but they secretly brought food into the homes to make sure that those young boys thrived. We know that the condition of slaves is not one of the best nutritional opportunities. And so in order to ensure that those boys survived, not just not being killed at birth, as they had been told to do, but to make sure that they survived, they snuck food into the house. And there are all sorts of interesting commentators. How did Pharaoh not find out about this? Perhaps they assumed that they were bringing the food for the girls, who were allowed to live, of course. Anyway, this idea that the midwives, whom we'll assume at this point, at least according to some of the commentators, are Egyptian, they go at great risk to themselves to not only not kill the Israelite baby, infants, boys, as asked of them, as told to do by Pharaoh, but they make sure that they continue to survive. Now, you might say, well, so what was their interest? Why would they do such a thing? Had they had some kind of manifestation from God? Does it say anything about that? No. And that, I think, is as powerful as anything else. They acted out of what you might call a surprising humanity to exist in the ancient world. This idea that the lives of babies, the lives of children, are something that no tyrant should be allowed to take away. It's not because they believed in the destiny of the Israelite people. Doesn't say anything about that. They feared God, meaning they feared this idea that every human being is created in the divine image and with a spark of divinity in them. And therefore, it's not their task, not anyone's task, to kill those children. So this perhaps, and again, you may say, well, you're getting a little bit far-fetched with this universal understanding and appreciation for humanity, but I think it's possible to read that in this action, especially if we see them as Egyptian midwives. They obeyed Pharaoh, they identified as Egyptians, but yet they saw something that was more powerful than that. And that's an incredibly impactful statement right at the beginning of the Parashah. So if even Egyptian midwives told by Pharaoh to do something are not willing to do that, then this idea that there is something greater than human tyrants, something greater than political power, than military power, to which we need to give consideration and whose instructions we need to abide by. I think perhaps there's a very strong message of that in this one verse. Anyone like to comment? Go ahead. Just one second. Is there anyone, I know Larry, you had a chance so far. Is there anyone else who'd like to say something? And if not, Larry, I'll let you go ahead. Barb, your mute's off, so I assume you wanted to say something. No, okay. Aviva, sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Michael. Well, I just want to continue your thought that when you go later in the chapter in verse, if you want to scroll down in verse 21, we see that in fact, these midwives are rewarded by God, this established households, which I think is an interesting factoid too, that midwives like become the mistresses of a whole household is an interesting kind of reward. But it would make sense that they are Egyptian and that God is rewarding them, because God did not give these kinds of rewards to specific Israelites. But I've always studied this segment, and with the chapter that comes after it, these are beautiful examples of the righteous Gentiles of the world. And that's why I kind of want them to be Egyptian, that they are, standing up truth to power. It's something that's really relevant, all over the news these days. It's, really looking out for the disenfranchised. It's these, and the fact that they're women is really significant, because we don't have so many examples of strong women like this in Torah. I want to flip backwards. The first verse that you showed us about the names, I think it's really begging the question, are they Hebrews or are they Egyptian? Because all the people mentioned, including the king of Egypt, nobody else in this whole chapter and a half has a name, has a proper name. Everybody is anonymous. Everybody. We've got the king of Egypt, like we know his name. Why isn't it mentioned? We've got the mother of the child, the sister of the child, the daughter of the Pharaoh. They're all anonymous. And I think that really helps us understand how difficult it is to stand up and make these difficult moral choices, in times that are challenging for everyone. So I've always seen it as the most beautiful example of the anonymous hero, that there are heroes among us. And, it's certainly something we've been talking about this year and beyond all the time, but you don't need to know everybody's name of the person who knows how to do the right thing and to stand up. They're not doing it for the recognition. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And it makes it more difficult if they're Egyptian than if they were Hebrews.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Aviva. And I think when I read this, I also thought of righteous Gentiles, and certainly in the context of the Shoah, of the Second World War, where people, and when they were asked afterwards, they didn't have any grandiose scheme or stories of seeking recognition or anything like that, or even for saving their own lives, they said that something's wrong here, and life is more significant than perhaps even my identity with a nation, and I need to do something about this in order to save a poor Jew, to save a baby that's been handed to me by a couple that's going on their way to God knows God knows where. And it also allowed me to stop something that you referred to, is that when we think about caregivers today, I mean, a midwife is a caregiver of a sort. And when we think of the caregivers today who had great risk to themselves, well before vaccines or proper testing were available, we have caregivers who had nothing to do with whom they were serving, had nothing to do with any kind of national, ethnic, or religious identity. They saw people who were in need, whether in long-term care facilities or whatever, and at great risk to themselves, they went ahead and did things that needed to be done in order to lechayot et hacholim, to offer life to those who are ill, who are stricken with COVID, who are susceptible to COVID. And I think there are many examples of that throughout history, and I think, Aviva, you're right in saying that most of those people remain anonymous, and it's up to us to give them names, whether it be Shifra or Pua. But when we talk about not just victims, but those who step into the breach to deal with great challenge and at great risk to themselves, we don't want to lump them into a category called heroes, righteous Gentiles, as appropriate as those terms would be. We want to be able to know their individual stories. And that goes for any type of event where there are mass numbers involved, because we can only comprehend and appreciate an event and an act when we identify it with an individual. You can't talk about thousands or millions. That's something that's often beyond our understanding. And so I think this idea of offering a name, and I'm glad you pointed out, Aviva, that these are the two who have names other than the generations of the people who came down to Egypt at the beginning of the Parashah, but these are the only players in this portion of the text who are given names. And I think for no small reason, these two act out in a very heroic, admirable manner, one which we would want to and strive to emulate. And I think it's no coincidence that their names are there. And for that reason, I would agree that these are most likely Egyptian midwives acting with the Hebrew, bringing the Hebrew children to a safe birth. Okay, so that's one issue I wanted to deal with today, and it's a beautiful one. I want to go back and talk about one that perhaps is a lot more troubling. And maybe we kind of pass over it. No pun intended. This one here, where we talk about, if we go back to the beginning of the Parashah, so first of all, we learned about the fact that Joseph, all these people who came down to Egypt are 70 souls. Joseph died and his brothers and that entire generation. The Israelites are fertile, prolific, etc. A new king arises who didn't recognize Joseph. So Vayomer Elamo, so he says to his people, Hine am b'nei Israel ravatzu mimenu, hava nitchakma lo pen yirbeh, vaya ki tikrana milchama v'nosaf gam hu al son'enu v'nilcham banu v'ala min ha'aretz. Okay, so, and Pharaoh said to his people, now he's Pharaoh, later on he becomes the king of Egypt, and that's an interesting discussion in itself. And of course, Pharaoh is also a generic name. It's not the specific name. Pharaoh, they had names, whether it's Seti or Necho, which you read about later in the Tanakh in the time of the kings, etc. So pharaohs had individual names, Ramses, of course, but never mentioned here. Only mentioned as Pharaoh, and later on, not even as that, as the king of Egypt. But that's for another day. So what does he say to his people? Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. So if you look at this phrase, there's something fascinating about it. Pharaoh says to his people, Hine am b'nei Israel, the people of Israel. So there's one thing that's quite interesting about that. The fact that no matter what has happened with the Israelites over these however many generations since the time of Joseph, although it seems like only one generation, v'chol hador hahu, regardless of the exact time, that group of people living in the land of Goshen has, at least in the eyes of Pharaoh, and this is perhaps the more interesting point, has an identity as a nation. B'nai Israel, the people of the children of Israel, if we translate it literally. Whether or not, at this point, the children of Israel themselves saw themselves as a nation. We're not quite sure. We're going to learn that as we go through the Parashah and other parts of Shemot. But the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, sees them as a nation. Why would he use that term? Because Rav Vatsum Mimenu. And of course, the next, he wants to call them a nation because he wants the people of Egypt to dissociate themselves from that people. He wants to separate them. He wants them to be seen as something other, something foreign, something that doesn't belong here, or something that belongs here, but only in subjugation. Not a people that stands on its own, on equal standing with the people of Egypt. They can stay here, but they can stay here as slaves. They're a slave people. That's their task in life. They are inferior to us. So you might say the fact that he's designating them as a people with that identity, that's not a compliment. That is a way of making sure that everybody sees them as the other. And there are just so many examples, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about this today, but I want to just kind of throw some of these things at you. When we talk about a people and we talk about how we see ourselves as a people, somebody just wrote in the chat box something about this feeling very close about what's going on in the States. So I'll refer to that first, because when we want to separate people, we want them to feel other, we want them to feel inferior, we want them to feel that they have no place, or they certainly are not the priority in our existence. And we've heard too much of that other talk, certainly south of the border in recent years, in recent months, and in recent days. But I want to go to a place where it hits home a lot harder. I mean, as much as we are pained by what's going on in the States, there's something I think that's a lot more powerful and, in my opinion, and in my sense, a lot more troubling. Because recently, there was a fascinating article in Haaretz talking about Avram Burg. I'm not sure if you know who or remember who Avram Burg was, but he comes from a very prominent modern religious Zionist family. He served in various positions. He was a speaker of the Knesset back in from 1999 until 2003. He was a member of the Labor Party. He was chairman of the Jewish Agency back in the late 90s. And he also served as a Knesset speaker. So all these positions representing a very powerful connection with the state of Israel and obviously the state of Israel's mission. And yet, a few days ago, what did he say he wants to do? He submitted, or he's about to submit, to the Jerusalem District Court that on our identity cards, Israeli identity cards, it says there's a space for nationality. And what does it say for nationality? Jewish. So he said he no longer considers himself as belonging to the Jewish nationality. Now, why does he say that? Again, this requires a fair bit of background, but I'll just give you in a nutshell. You probably know that in 2018, the state of Israel passed a basic law calling Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. I'll bring up the text in a moment so you can take a look at it. But what it says is, at least according to Avram Burg, and this is the relevance, and I'll bring up the text while we're talking. He says that giving such clear and blatant preference to the status of only the Jews who live in the state of Israel, he can no longer identify with the nationality that does that, meaning that causes others who are not Jewish to feel inferior, to feel that they don't have a place. Let me just bring up the text of that basic law for a moment. We'll take a look at it briefly, but this is really to give you a chance to think a little bit about this idea of nationality and how we identify and how that affects the identification of others who live among us. 1 second, let me just get that up on the screen here. Oh, I gotta stop sharing first, sorry. I know you'll indulge me on my technical non-expertise. Okay. Okay, just give me a thumbs up when you can see the text on the screen. Okay, I'll make it a little bit larger. Actually, let's go to the beginning. So it's not a long text. The basic law is not a lot, but I'll just go over things briefly. And so the basic principles: the land of Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established. Nation state of the Jewish people. Exercise of the right of national self-determination is unique to the Jewish people. The name of the state is Israel, the state flag, the state emblem, the state anthem. Jerusalem complete and united is the capital of Israel. Hebrew is the state language. It does mention in a couple of contexts the fact that the Arab language has special status. Nothing shall affect that status before the law came into force. The state shall be open to Jewish immigration. The state shall strive to ensure the safety of members of the Jewish people. The state shall act in the diaspora to preserve the ties between the state and members of the Jewish people. So you might say, well, fine, but that's what Israel is. That's the way we've always seen Israel. Israel is the Jewish. Israel is mainly for the Jews. So that's the way most of us grew up. But when we consider our place and the place of those who perhaps have been marginalized in Canada, whether it be Indigenous people, whether it be Blacks, and all the peoples who have experienced, at least in their eyes, oppression, subjugation, discrimination. We can talk about North America, but we can talk about many other countries. Avram Burg says, if you were to take this basic law and take away and substitute other nationalities as opposed to Jewish, for example, and lehavdil, as we say in Hebrew, to differentiate. It's certainly not exactly the same, but in any case, worthy of a comparison. If you were to put in German there and allow Jews to read this in Germany in the 1930s, perhaps the Nuremberg laws are a lot harsher than this, but nevertheless, this idea of preferential treatment, of a different status, and it's quite clear a superior status to a certain group within a country, where does that leave the others? Where does that leave the others in terms of identifying? It leaves them as a separate nation, another nation, at best. A people who, you're here, but you're here because we're allowing you to be here. This is the historic land of the Jewish people. And Avram Burg says, yeah, it's wonderful, it's historic land of the Jewish people, but Abraham didn't come from here. Abraham's first meeting with God was not necessarily in the Holy Land. The development of the sense of nationality of the Israelite people, we just talked about Am B'nai Israel, that sense of nationality occurred in Egypt, not before they came here. The Talmud, which we follow, is not the Jerusalem Talmud, it's the Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud developed outside of the land of Israel. So those are some of the examples Avram Burg gives to the fact that, yes, Israel has a very important place in Jewish identity today and has in the past and for hundreds and hundreds of years, whether it be the temple, et cetera, or all the stories and narratives that we read about in the Tanakh. But there are other people there. And to elevate the status of one people to the clear degradation of others there, or at least to a secondary status, is something that he has a problem with. Now, it may be perhaps clear from the tone I'm using that I somewhat identify with Avram Burg. I think there are many people today who feel that not only the basic law, but the approach to groups other than perhaps the ruling group is something that's problematic. And there's a whole discussion of Israeli politics is for another day. But this idea of how we identify what is our place in a country, how do we feel that we have a share, an equal share in that country? Now, you might say, well, but every country's like that. Every place has national symbols that were developed over time, over centuries perhaps, and anyone coming to that country has to be aware of the fact that there is already some type of national identity there. Well, and that's a challenge. The challenge to have a national identity, but at the same time, make sure that others feel that they have an equal place there, either through the recognition of different identities that exist, or at least perhaps offering opportunity for expression of that identity. I think Canada is a place where perhaps not ideally done, but it's probably one of the best places in the world where people have an opportunity to express their various and varied identities. But I don't know if we've created the ideal state in terms of that. The United States is going through some very serious upheaval about how people feel, whether they belong in that society as it has become over the last number of years and where it's going. And Israel, I would say, is at least, if not more troubling in terms of how others, as designated by the state or by this basic law, are going to feel as we move forward. How are people who have no identification or little identification with an anthem, with symbols, with a flag, how are they going to feel a place in that society, in that state, in that nation state? How are they going to feel committed to that nation state? How do you develop that commitment? And I'm not saying there's an easy answer to that, but I think it demands a certain degree of openness, which isn't necessarily expressed in this basic law, and as indicated by Avram Borg a few days ago. So whether the court accepts his request to remove the Jewish from the nationality on his identity card, I don't know. There are examples in the past where people petitioned the state to remove. Yoram Kanyuk asked that his religion, Jewish, be removed from his identity card, and it was granted. There were attempts a number of years ago where rather than listing one's nationality on the card, rather than listed as Jewish, listed as Israeli. And then it was decided, the court ruled, there is no such thing as an Israeli nationality. And so you can't register something fictitiously that does not exist. So we don't consider Israeli, at least as the court designated, a nationality. It's considered citizenship. So you might ask, well, what do you mean? What's the difference between nationality and citizenship? Well, that's a good question. When you talk about your nationality in Canada, would you consider your citizenship and nationality Canadian? Or would you consider your citizenship Canadian? Is nationality something else in Canada? Or perhaps in Canada, there is the sense that that entails nationality as well as the legal and formal designation of citizenship. So I dare not suggest or try to provide you with any types of answers to these questions. As you know, that's not my task at all. But I bring these up because when we talk about Pharaoh's attempts to isolate and designate others in Egyptian society as not really belonging, as there to be subjugated, of course, much more harshly than what we read in the basic law. And again, Lahavdil, I'm not comparing those two, but this idea of making others among us who aren't exactly what we are, whether racially, whether religiously, whether ethically, feel that they don't really belong, they don't have a place, even if they see themselves as some kind of national group. That's not new. That's not something that's only from the last 200 years when we talk about this idea of nationalism. That type of isolation goes back, or attempts to isolate, I should say, that goes back to the Bible. And that's why I think when you might say, well, you're reading isms and terminology from modern period into the Bible, and that's not appropriate. Well, I think that the human nature is something that's been, albeit developed over thousands of years, over the millennia. There's something pretty consistent about human nature as we read about in the Bible that can be understood in today's context as well. We read a number of places in the Bible quite clearly. Why do we have to watch out for the poor and the oppressed? Because they're always going to be poor and oppressed. There are always going to be people who are on the margin. They're always going to be there. The Torah tells us that 3,000 years ago. So that's not something new. And today, there's still plenty of poor and oppressed. And it's still our duty, as it was, as the injunctions in the Torah suggest, it's our responsibility to care for them. Similarly, this idea of identity is something that's not new either. Whether we call it nationalism or or whatever, that challenge of having a group of people in a land, in a place, feel that they belong, and having a variety of people feel a sense of belonging, that challenge goes back thousands of years. So with that, if anyone wants to offer a comment or a question, I'm happy to entertain that now. And my main task was to give you something to think about in terms of how we identify with nationality, as even the first Parashah of Shemot suggests to us. Barbara, go ahead.
I have two thoughts. I went back and thought. Regarding the midwives, I'm wondering if there is foreshadowing here, that if the midwives stood up to Pharaoh and they succeeded, that allowed the door to get open for Moses to stand up to Pharaoh and then have the final result. So I kind of thought of that as a bit of foreshadowing. The second thing is what we just finished talking about. I wondered if the underlying reason behind the law is to preserve Jewish existence, considering what we've been through.
So to your first point, I would say beautiful foreshadowing, especially if Shifra and Pua happened to be Miriam and Yocheved. But you're right, this idea of standing up to a tyrant might be some kind of foreshadowing or hint of what's needed and what's to come. And it's no coincidence, if we're talking about oppression, that slaves particularly in the United States in the late 18th and 19th century, were so inspired by the story of the Exodus and so powerfully identified with the need to maintain an identity, even under oppression, cultural and religious identity, while maintaining some of their own culture and religious identity from Africa, not just but there's this fantastic confluence of African identity and Christianity together. But this idea of the need to maintain that identity, to maintain hope, and that at some point there will be some respite at worst, but redemption from the oppression of the Pharaoh, of the modern day Pharaoh in their time. The other aspect of the preservation, I'd say exactly because we've been in that situation, we can't be passing these types of basic laws. If our attempt to survive is based only on the subjugation of others, and I'll quote what Avram Berg says about that. He says very clearly, he says, if I can find the right sentence here, he says, your question assumes that the Jewish people is numbers and genetics. And I think that the Jewish people is ideas and values. If the Jewish people is 14 million Rabbi Kahanas, then that people should be eliminated. If the Jewish people is one Nelson Mandela or one Dalai Lama, let UNESCO enshrine it in perpetuity. So survival, as he says, is not about numbers. Survival is about maintaining values and ideas that have been significant and consistent to Jewish history and culture for thousands of years. If that's not what we're maintaining, then we have to question, or if we're not maintaining that through the values that we want to perpetuate, and we have to question whether that maintenance, whether that survival is something that's worth doing.
Good point. All
right, I've depressed you enough for one day. No, but we have to be careful when we read some of these very powerful stories in the Torah. We want to identify with heroes. We want to identify with bold and daring acts. But we need to understand where that's coming from, and we need to, I would say, no less, find the relevance in those incidents today and make sure that if our position has changed from slave to our own masters, we have to make sure that we remain only our own masters and not the masters of others. So I wish all of you a wonderful day on that note, and look forward to seeing you next week, if not before.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Everybody take care and stay well. Thanks so much.
Michael.
Thank you, Michael.